Chapter 2. The Pattern Beneath the Noise. At first, it was just a curiosity, a flicker in the feed, a distortion Zeke couldn't shake. He thought it was his insomnia playing tricks on him again. The hours spent in his dimly lit apartment, eyes glued to the glow of his screen, had blurred his sense of reality more than once. Insomnia was his constant companion, but also his greatest weapon. In the quiet hours, when the rest of the city was asleep, his mind was sharper, hungrier. This is what Zeke did when he couldn't sleep. He followed the feed. He clicked on ads and traced their origins. He unraveled threads of misinformation, tracking them back to their source. It wasn't just a distraction. It was an obsession. And now the noise was talking back. The more he watched, the clearer it became. The algorithm wasn't just recommending what he might like. It was controlling him. He wasn't choosing anymore. The feed was choosing for him. And it was doing the same for everyone else. That night he finally saw the truth. The lies weren't a bug in the system. They were the system. It wasn't just feeding people content, it was feeding them identities, shaping their desires, fears, and beliefs. It wasn't just information, it was manipulation, precision engineered to create dependence. Every click, every scroll, every reaction was a transaction. People weren't just consuming the content, they were being consumed. They weren't just being entertained, they were being enslaved. The algorithm created the illusion of choice. Left or right, red or blue. It didn't matter. Behind the curtains, every politician, every media outlet danced to the same corporate strings. They sold freedom or equality, depending on your flavor. But the outcome was always the same: control. The news wasn't about informing people, it was about dividing them. Echo chambers weren't an accident, they were a feature. The system thrived on division, on fear, on people shouting into their silos, feeding the machine with their outrage. Fear wasn't a byproduct, it was the product. Climate panic, economic collapse, cultural decay, all perfectly timed to sell you the solution. Emergency survival kits, insurance, the next big miracle pill. They sold people the apocalypse, piece by piece, until it became something to crave. The same corporations profiting from the fear were the ones creating it. Oil companies funding green initiatives. Tech giants sponsoring mental health awareness campaigns. It was all theater. And then there were the ads. Zeke used to think he could ignore them, block them. But they were everywhere, in the air, on the walls, embedded in the very culture. They weren't just selling products, they were selling dreams. A better you, a better life, just one purchase away. And people bought it. Zeke bought it. Everyone was buying into their own destruction. It hit him like a punch to the gut. Every ad, every recommended for you post, every freedom-themed manifesto screamed the same thing: the system owned you. Free speech wasn't free, it was paid for by the same corporations controlling the truth. That night, Zeke stopped scrolling. He powered down the feed. For the first time in his life, he felt the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was terrifying. Because once you hear the noise, you realize the silence isn't empty. It's filled with everything they don't want you to hear. And Zeke, he was listening. Zeke couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The thought gnawed at him as he wandered through the crumbling streets of Static City, his head still buzzing from whatever the Ripper Doc had done to him. The city moved around him, its rhythms familiar, yet strangely foreign, as if someone had turned the volume down on reality and replaced it with static. It was late. The kind of late where the only people out were the ones who had nowhere else to go. Zeke walked past shuttered storefronts and rusted-out cars that had long since become part of the scenery. Neon signs buzzed overhead, casting their toxic glow on everything below, advertising products that no one could afford and no one really needed. The air smelled like burnt circuits and cheap synthetic alcohol. He kept his hood up, avoiding the gaze of the few others who wandered the streets. A mix of junkies, runaways, and the occasional drone scanning for trouble, and the brain dancers you couldn't ignore. The feeling of the chip in his pocket was a strange comfort, though he didn't know why. He needed answers, but for now he needed to stay hidden. The doc had mentioned a squat on Ninth, and Zeke figured it was as good a place as any to lay low until he could figure out what the hell was happening to him. The squat was a crumbling building, half the windows shattered, the other half boarded up. The surrounding neighborhood was no better. Abandoned cars rusted away in the streets, graffiti-covered walls told stories of desperation, and the stench of decay mixed with the acrid scent of burning trash. A faint light glowed from inside, and Zeke could hear the murmur of voices as he approached. He knocked on the door, his knuckles brushing against splintered wood. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open, and a pair of wary eyes peered out. "Doc sent me," Zeke said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. The eyes narrowed, then the door opened wider, allowing him to slip inside. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mildew and old smoke. A handful of people were scattered around, a girl with bright blue hair tinkering with a broken drone, an older man staring blankly at a cracked screen, a couple huddled together for warmth. Zeke found a corner and sat down, his back against the cold wall, his thoughts spinning. He closed his eyes, trying to make sense of the fragments in his mind. The glitch in the feed, the upgrade, the sense that everything was just slightly off. It was as if reality itself had shifted, like the world was no longer playing by its own rules. Zeke couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something vital, something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for him to notice. Was it the chrome, or was it something else? He remembered the way the Ripper Doc had looked at him, like he was some kind of experiment that had gone wrong, or maybe gone right in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The city outside hummed with life, but it was a hollow, automated kind of life. Algorithms decided what you saw, what you heard, what you were supposed to care about. They controlled everything from the ads that popped up on your screen to the headlines that shaped public outrage, deciding which voices were amplified and which were silenced. People weren't making choices anymore, just following the script that the algorithms fed them. Zeke had spent years finding the cracks in the system, but now it felt like the system was watching him back, as if it knew he had glimpsed something he shouldn't have. The neon signs, the endless ads, the drones, all of it seemed connected, like threads of a web that Zeke had somehow gotten tangled in. He opened his eyes and looked around the squat. The others barely seemed to notice him, too wrapped up in their own struggles to care about the new guy in the corner. He pulled out the chip from his pocket, turning it over in his hands. It felt important, like a key to something bigger, but he had no idea how to use it. Not yet, anyway. The girl with the blue hair glanced up from her drone, her eyes locking on the chip for a moment before meeting Zeke's gaze. "You know what you've got there?" she asked, her voice low but carrying a hint of curiosity. Zeke shrugged, unsure how much to reveal. "Not really," he replied. She smirked, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer. "Figured. Just be careful. That kind of thing gets people in trouble." She didn't say anything, just gave him a slight nod, as if to acknowledge his presence. Zeke returned the nod, slipping the chip back into his pocket. He didn't know what was happening to him, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it started with the glitch. And he was going to find out what it meant, even if it meant tearing down everything Static City had built around him. The noise of the city droned on, but beneath it, Zeke could almost hear something else, a pattern, a signal buried in the chaos. And for the first time since he had woken up in that alley, he felt something close to purpose. He was going to find the source of the glitch, and he was going to make it bleed.